So, hello. Welcome to my session about how to document and communicate software architecture these days. And I hope you can hear me. It's new for me to. I'm on a different place. I'm not at home, so it was a bit difficult to arrange all the things. So hope everything is fine. Yeah, I see it. It's working. So welcome. My name is Falk Sippach. I'm from Germany, from a company I'm working for, Embarc. It's situated in Hamburg. I do live in Darmstadt, next to Frankfurt. So I will tell you a bit more about me later. Let's right dive in the content. And a, a few weeks ago, or maybe months, I saw it's about 1 year ago, actually. I saw this tweet on Twitter where a guy said it's a new thing, a new rising star. It's called Docs as Code or Architecture as Code. He says it's currently at the beginning. And oh, I see there's something not well. It's working again. And I think that's not true because documentation as code, as I call it, is already a thing since about 10 years or maybe more than that. And about 10 years ago, I started to give talks about it at conferences. And I think it's still a very important topic. And I want to introduce it to you today. Let's start with a short introduction. What are the main goals? What are we have to do as an architect in our day-to-day job? And this is a image or picture. It's taken from a German book from Gernot Starke, Effective Software Architecture. And you see in this short workflow there you have to clarify your requirements. Then there's some phase to design the architecture. Then there's a communication part. You have to communicate all the things about your system structure, about your decisions to all the stakeholders of your project. And then there could also be an evaluation, a review of your architecture, and then you start again because most of the time we work agile, so we work in agile context in incremental and iteratively. And actually, there's nothing about documentation. But if you have a look at it, and then it's part of the communication. And then if you want to communicate your ideas of your architecture, of your design, then you need something you have written down as a documentation, for example. Actually, most of the time we are not we don't really like to document. So there are lots of excuses for not writing documentation. This book is not real. It's it's a fake cover. So maybe you know it. It's from the Practical Dev. And actually, I don't think that's a good idea to don't write documentation. There's so many good reasons for it. For example, it can support us if in our design phase. It's also quite important for communication. We already talked about it. Then it's very important to have something we can evaluate. So for a review of our architecture. And most of the time, a few weeks, maybe a few months later, there's always this question about the why, because something didn't work well, and we think, why did we decide it this way? And nobody can tell why it was decided this way. And we also should not forget our new colleagues, which are joining our project, and they are also quite happy if they find some documentation. So let's see some reasons why most of us, so maybe developers and also architects, think that architecture documentation is boring or is so difficult. And I think there are some reasons, and let's have a look at it. One of the reasons is that we don't have the right tools. So we use tools for documentation that we are not used to, that are maybe too difficult to use. We have too much context switches, media breaks, so we have to switch between different tools, different programs, applications, and that's not that good. Also, the file sharing. So where is our documentation lying? It's also a problem. Most of the time we have some file sharing, maybe something like SharePoint. That's not really a good idea, but it works, but there are better solutions we will see in a few minutes. Then there's a problem that most of the time we have lots of redundancy. That means that we have to write the same information again and again. And informations are not only redundant in maybe the documentation, they are also written in the source code or in some models, in the data model, for example. And that's also a problem because redundancy means that the documentation or the informations not synchrone. So maybe in the one side we have old informations and then it's not clear which one is the newest one. The next one is we have too much text, so we should use more diagrams, but diagrams make much more, we have much more to do to create diagrams. Also, we should do most of the things automatically, and manual work is not that nice. So that's also a problem if you have to do things manually. Also, if the documentation is not up to date, then nobody will read it, or if they read it, then they will see the wrong information. That's also a problem. And that nobody reads it anyway is also a problem because we are not that enthusiastic to write documentation if we know that nobody will read it. So let's have a look at what does documentation or documenting the architecture mean. There's a good book about this topic. It's called Documenting Software Architectures. They have the 7 rules for good documentation. And we will have a look at them in this talk again. So can also have a look now, but we will see this slide again. What are the content of our documentation about software architecture? What is the content? And there are different parts we should document, but I think that for the start, if we want to start small, then we need something like an architectural overview. And in the architectural overview, we only need a few informations. And there are 2 sides. On the one side, we have the requirements, the architectural goals, for example. And on the other side, we have the solutions, the decisions, the technologies which we've chosen and something like that. And I've break it down to more detail, the ingredients for an architectural overview, and all this content we need to make good architecture decisions to design our architecture. And on the upper row line, there are all the requirements like the quality goals, the constraints, which are from the project management, for example, the system context, where we can see what is inside our solution, our software system, and what will be outside. What do we have to use? Where do we have to use interfaces, for example, or to implement interfaces? And there should also be something like a mission statement, which is maybe only a few sentences, which we could start if we are new in a project. So, which brings us the main content or the main informations about our software system. And the line below, there are all the solution information about, for example, some picture, an informal overview. It's like a building block view, but some more information. For example, with something outside, which we only would see in a system context, but also with some information about technologies, maybe programming languages, or, for example, the things about frameworks, libraries, and so on. We have also to decide about architecture styles or about architectural patterns, architectural principles. We also have to decide which tools, which solutions, which technologies we want to use, and these decisions we also should document, and the technologies are also part of this. There are some examples which a colleague of mine, Stefan Zörner, has published. Actually, it's in German only, so if you can speak German, then just have a look at our webpage. There are flyer, for example, about the German Corona Warn app. So it's the Corona, the app which we could help to minimize the contact tracing app during the Corona time. There are also some slides about it, and there's another example. It's a chess engine, which is also documented. And if you want to have a look, please just go to our website, and there's the link below. So let's go to the current topic, and it's called documentation as code. And there was a friend of mine, Ralf Müller. He had this idea to show something like a maturity level model. Maybe you know this from REST. There's also a maturity level model for REST, and we adapted it, and I made this one. And we have 7 stages, and stage below, stage 0, that's traditional documentation, and we will have a look how can we go to all the stages up there until maybe stage number 6. So let's start with the basics. It's called traditional documentation. I forgot to translate the header, sorry. So it's called traditional documentation. And most of the time we put the documentation in separate places, maybe in file sharing or SharePoint or something like that. We use tools like Microsoft Word or Visio or maybe PowerPoint to document or write documentation, to create diagrams and so on. We store it on network drives, for example. Maybe we also use wikis. Wikis are very cool tools, I think, because we can use it collaboratively, as we can work together with others on the same document. But wikis are also a place where I think documents go there to die, or this guy here in this slide is Ward Cunningham, the inventor of the wiki. And wiki, actually, it's a joke, of course, but it could also stand for where information kills itself. And maybe it's the same problem for you. If you use a wiki, in the Java world, where I am at home, there's Confluence very, very many times. I see Confluence at my customers at the moment. And Confluence is a cool tool, but the problem is if there's some information inside Confluence, and it's very difficult for me to find it again. So we have a search, and the search could show us where the documents are, but most of the time it's too many results, and then it's too heavy to find the right one. And wiki will see there are better ideas to use other tools instead of a wiki. So let's go to the stage number 1 of our maturity level, and it's called lightweight text formats, and we save our documentation as well in the code repo, like our source code as well. And the idea is we can write our documentation the same way we also write our source code. So with lightweight text formats, for example, we can use the same tools like our IDE, like IntelliJ, Eclipse, or Visual Studio Code or whatever. And actually, the main contrast point is something like using Microsoft Word. And there was this German poster in the advertisement poster. I'm not sure if you are also from Germany, you may know what I mean here, but the spoiler is it's a campaign of the anti-AIDS association or something like that, and they say that you should use LaTeX, which means something as a synonym for condoms. And when I saw this poster, I thought about LaTeX as a tool, as a lightweight markup language, which I used in at my university time. And I thought the main thing is that this girl don't use Word, so she should use LaTeX. That would be a better solution instead of Word. So actually, it's a joke, of course. What are the problems with Microsoft Word or any other what you see is what you get tool? It's most of the time a binary format. Word actually is now XML, but it's still some very special XML format. It's not that easy to work with many people on the same document. You have to merge conflicts that makes some trouble. You can, and that's also a problem, send documents by mail. And by mail means you have lots of copies out there, and then you have some changes, and you have to merge them again. And then you have different versions, one version 1.0 and one version 1.1, and so on. And then you don't know which is the right one at the moment. And that's quite difficult. Another problem is that it's page-oriented, so you have page numbers, header, footer, and that's not that easy to lay out your documents. If you have used Word, for example, for study work, then it was 20 years ago, it was difficult to have more than 20, 30 pages. So if you had a document with 50 or more pages, then it was quite less was not useful. It was quite difficult to use it. So in our main tools we use as a developer or as a developing architect, we use plain text formats like our programming languages. We use our IDEs like IntelliJ and so on, where we write our code. We use command line tools, shell scripts, and so on. And we, of course, use version control systems like Git or Subversion and so on. And why don't we use also these tools for documentation? And that's all what documentation as code is all about. So it means that we put our documentation close to our source code. We store it in the same repository or maybe in a neighbor repository, but also in a repository. So it's easy to version it or to make a diff and see what are the differences. It's very easy to deliver our documentation, the final documentation synchronously with our releases for our software releases. It's very easy if we, for example, use Git to work offline on our documentation. And if you know Git, then it's not that difficult to merge text like Markdown, AsciiDoc, or other text formats. We can integrate it as a part of our build process, like in the Java world, we use Maven or maybe Gradle. And it's quite easy to integrate the documentation part in our build process. We could also generate some documentation from our sources or from data models or other models which are already there. And we can always automate it. It will be generated again and again. And we have always the current version, for example. And there will be quite a few output formats like PDF or HTML, or maybe also slides in form of Reveal.js, or maybe also we could export it to Confluence to make it easy to share it with colleagues in our company which are not used to to read Markdown or something like that, and then we could use also Confluence, for example. So one of the questions is which markup language should we choose? And there was this tweet a few years ago of Michael Simmons. He said that he likes Markdown because it's quite easy to use and it needs not that much concentration to write. I think he means that it's easier to write than, for example, a Word document where you have to lay out and format all the lines separately, manually with your mouse and so on. Markdown is a great standard for very easy markup content. It have lots of features like links and code blocks and images, so including images and so on. But actually, there's also some parts are missing because these parts are quite important for real good documentation, like a table of content or tables, or includes so modularized documentation, for example, or including planned UML and something like that. So what solution for this missing parts of Markdown? You need an extension. And the question is which extension can we choose? There are quite a lot. So most of the companies which use Markdown for their tools have most of the time their own extension. And actually, it's not really an extension, it's more like a dialect. So that's quite difficult to use the right one because it has to work in our toolchain. So our toolchain has to know this dialect as well. And it has to work in our editor, for example, IntelliJ or our IDE in the preview mode. So that could be a problem. So why don't we choose AsciiDoc instead of Markdown? AsciiDoc is a more powerful syntax than Markdown. It's also for technical documentation. It's written in Ruby. It runs also on JavaScript. It's transpiled with Opal. And it also works on the Java virtual machine. It's wrapped with JRuby, for example. So you can use AsciiDoc in form of ASCII Doctor. That's the interpreter there, which uses or which generates PDF or something like that from AsciiDoc documents. And we can just integrate it in our build tools like Maven or like Gradle because it works just in the JVM. There are no dialects, and my friend Ralph already told you about him. He also invented this maturity level model. He said that Michael should also try AsciiDoc because it brings much more content or much more features. So what looks a basic documentation as code process with AsciiDoc, and that would also fit for Markdown actually. So, but let's stay with AsciiDoc. There's our Git repository. In the Git repository, we would, beside our source code, we also would put our documentation in form of AsciiDoc files, maybe images in form in binary formats like PNG or JPEG, but maybe also plant UML. We will have to look at it later. And there will be an interpreter. It's called AsciiDoctor. So AsciiDoc is the language. AsciiDoctor is the tool which translates AsciiDoc documents, for example, to HTML or maybe to PDF or whatever. But it would be the most easiest way to use AsciiDoc for our documentation. And there are quite a few nice features. So it's more easy to write documentation. It's more like writing emails. We don't have to use our mouse to format and make something bold or may underline some part or whatever. It's just writing text, and we can include all the markup comments to maybe make some part of our text bold. And it's very easy to structure it in subdocuments, so we can also modularize our documentation like we also do for our source code. We can restructure these sub-documents according to our stakeholders. So we can have different output documents for different stakeholders from the same source. So we have one single source of truth. That's very difficult, quite important in this part. We can also use images. We reference them, so we don't have to embed it like in Word. It's very easy to versionize it because it's the same as we do with code, and it's quite easy with the rules of AsciiDoc or also for Markdown to format our code and also to include source code, for example. We can reference source code. And it's quite easy to use the same processes like for source code development, like code reviews. We can also review your documentation. We can use pull requests. We can version it in Git and can create different results like HTML5 or docbook, and then also PDF, or can export it to Confluence and so on. So that's the first stage of our maturity level. Let's go to the second one. And the second one is not actually part of the documentation as code idea, but it's also very important, and that's the reason why I think it should be part of our maturity level. It says that we should use standard structures. We should use templates for our documentation, And that's because of the reader will be lucky if we get the same structure most of the time and don't have to think about it if we get some new documentation, how it is structured and so on. And that gives some orientation about the content also while creating the content. So for us, it's also easier to write content because we can put it on the right place. And this is also part of our 7 rules for good documentation. So number 4, they also said use standard structures. And one of the most famous standard structures or templates is called ARC42. It's developed by Gernot Starke and Peter Ruschka, and it's on the left below. There's a short explanation. They provide a template for architecture documentation. It's open source. It's quite easy to use, pragmatic. It doesn't cost anything, and we can just use it to document our architecture with all the parts. We've seen something which is important for the architecture overview, for example. And actually, it's like a cupboard where you put all your stuff in different places. So these are the main parts, like requirements, like the goals, architecture goals, like the constraints, like the system context, like our solution strategy, like our building block views or runtime views, and so on. And it's quite easy to find the right place where to put the content, and it's well structured. There are some other models like ARC42. Another one is from Simon Brown. He has written some books which are published on LeanPub. There's, for example, the first part, it's for developers showing how to do software architecture. And there's a second one which focuses on visualizing, documenting, and exploring our software architecture. And there he describes another model. It's called C4 model. And it's quite, or it's similar to the ARC42 I already told you. It's some differences, but if you're interested, just have a look. We won't go deeper than this slide at the moment. I also told you about modular documentation, and maybe this is the master document, which is for the developers, for example. There we can include different chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 8, whatever. These chapters could also include some images, for example, or include some source code, or include some sub-chapters. And all of this, from all of this, we could create our full documentation as a PDF or as HTML. And there could also be some other stakeholders. For example, the business would also be interested, what would only be interested in chapter 1 and chapter 2, for example. And there could also be something interested in security topics, and they would only get the subchapter 8.1, for example. So it's quite easy to modularize your documentation. You don't have to copy and paste it again. So it's just one single source of truth. That's also very, very important. Let's go to the next stage, and that would be about images. Images are very, very important because it helps, it's much more easier to understand than lots of text. So I really appreciate if you have some diagrams which are up to date and where I can maybe also scribble some sketch notes inside to think about or to develop our design strategy further. And the problem with images is that they are most of the time binary formats, and if we have to change them, then we need some vector graphic application which we have to open, make our changes, export PNG or JPEG again, and embed it again, and that's too much work, and most of the time we won't do it. So the problem is the images won't be up to date. So let's have a look at what are possible solutions for this problem. One of the solutions is called blend-UML. It's something like AsciiDoc for text formats. Is blend-UML also a textual language where we can describe diagrams and can also manage complex diagrams with simple text. Let's have a look. Let's have a look about a small example. blend-UML understands most of the UML standard, so also something like sequence diagrams. And I can show you what will be generated from this text on the left-hand side. It's quite easy. We can also read it. It's not difficult to understand. It's very easy to make a diff between an older version and the current version to see what has changed. It's much more easier than to diff or make a difference between two images, for example. There are also more complex diagrams possible, but the problem is if the diagram has too much content, then because it's rendered automatically, it won't produce the formats you like. So there are some possibilities, some hints you can give to render it the way you like it. But as larger as a diagram will become, the more difficult it is to render it to render it in the right way. So it will be a solution for small diagrams, maybe also for generated diagrams. Maybe we read the source code in our build process and generate from the source code some small diagrams of some structure of our program, for example. That would be quite nice. And there are also some alternatives like ETA, it's more like ASCII art, or eGraph, and there are some more. If you want to have a look which textual graphic formats are existing, there's a nice tip. There's a server, it's called Croki.io. Croki.io helps us to render diagrams if we just give them the text about a HTTP request, then we get a render diagram from this Croki server back, and they understand beside blend-UML also quite a few other diagram formats like Mermaid.js. Maybe that's also you've heard about it, and some others. So please have a look at Croki. It's a really cool tool. We could also use or install your own Kroki server as a Docker container, the Docker image. So you could also host your own version of it to be independent if maybe the original Kroki is not available for some time, or maybe they shut it down or whatever. And it's open source, so you can just use it. There's also this, there's an example. There's also the possibility to put your diagram as text in a formula, and then on the box on the top of this page, then you can choose between, for example, C4 with planned UML or Mermaid.js or plain planned UML or whatever, and it will be rendered on the right side, for example. So please have a look. There's a HTTP URL on the bottom of this page, which you can copy and can embed in your AsciiDoc document, for example. And every time your AsciiDoc document will be rendered, or there will be created a PDF or HTML, this image will be generated and put in your documentation result, for example. So let's see what is left. There are some more stages. For example, stage number 4. There, I think it's very important to have the right tools and to more integrate all the existing tools like our IDE or our build automation tools with generating our documentation. So it would be nice to automate all the build process and integrate the documentation as well. It would be nice to for us as a developer to don't have to switch between different tools. So it would be very cool if we could just use our IDE and also generate diagrams, for example, and it would be easy to import and export. And we saw a simple workflow with AsciiDoc a few minutes ago, and there's something more to tell about it. So it's the same picture, but it has a bit more content. For example, we could use the ARC42 template. ARC42 offers ready-to-use templates also for Word and for Conference, but also for AsciiDoc and Markdown. And we could just import it and use it. And then this AsciiDoc interpreter could also use diagram plugins to render planned UML, for example, and could also generate PDF or generate or export it to Conference and such tools. The next one, how to integrate the docs as code approach in your IDE. And there are also plugins, in this case for IntelliJ, which helps us with syntax highlighting and a problem view, for example, or here with the context-sensitive suggestions, which are, for example, image files, which we can choose to render. Also to include other AsciiDoc subdocuments, for example, or some variables which I can use in AsciiDoc, for example. And there's also like a tree which shows me the internal structure of my AsciiDoc document. And I can also collapse some blocks to make it more readable in the moment. And we have type templates, for example, if I have the same text again and again, and can just integrate it with a small, short text, for example. The next one is also a very, very nice integration, and maybe you've heard about Draw.io, or how it is called now. It's called diagrams.net. And it's a small JavaScript tool which you can use standalone on macOS or Windows, which you can also use in the browser. You have to call diagrams.net, the URL. And you can also embed it in Conference, or most of the time it is already embedded in Conference, or you can embed it in some IDEs, for example, here in IntelliJ. And then you can, in the same tool where you write your source code, where you write your documentation, you can also generate vector graphics, which you could save as SVG, so a vector graphics format, but also as a PNG or JPEG, a binary format. And it's very cool that you can put in your binary formats like PNG or JPEG, you could also store the metadata for the vector graphics inside the binary format. So you can reopen your PNG again and again, and you can edit your diagram, but you can use it as a PNG, so you can reference it more easily as a picture, and you can show it in your browser and so on. So it's also quite a cool integration. So just have a look at diagrams.net or Troy.io plugins for your IDE, for example. There's another very important tool which helps us a lot. It's called Toolchain, and it brings a lot of import plugins on the left-hand side and a few output plugins on the right-hand side. I already told you about the conference export. That's part of this Toolchain on the upper right part of this picture. And you could also generate Word documents or EPUB, for example, for ebooks, and Reveal.js for slides, for presentations, for example. On the left-hand side, there are a few input formats you could use. For example, Jira issues you could import in your AsciiDoc documentation, or also informations from your Git repository, or also informations which are already in your enterprise architect model, or in your Visio files, or in your PowerPoint presentations, or Excel sheets, or lots of cool things you could just integrate, which are already there, and you don't have to copy it and write it again and again. So just have a look at Toolchain. It's quite easy to use. It's a cool tutorial on the website, toolchain.org. Let's have a look at it, or just have a look at it. And how to use it to get started is already here on the slide. It was a tweet a few months ago. You have to get a wrapper script, CW, and then you have to make it executable, and then you can just call it. Use it to download the ARC42 template, for example, or to generate a site. And it generates the file structure for your process. And when you have a look, there are all the ARC42 chapter of the template you already seen a few minutes ago. The next, what I want to show you is the actual import. I already told you there are lots of imports for Toolchain, and the very interesting part is the textual input, so you can just read Excel files and generate, for example, CSV. But it's not that impressive. There would also be the possibility to write AsciiDoc directly, and in this AsciiDoc you could have the same formatting, like colors and background colors and the width of your columns and so on. So
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, Falk. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
it's just we're running out of time, so maybe you can just finish the most important stuff, because there are also a couple of questions for you. Sorry.
Okay, I will come to an end. There are lots of more cool features, so I can't show you all of them at the moment, but the slides will be available later. So let me just wrap it up. I showed you lots of the idea of documentation as code, and also continuous documentation, where you integrate your documentation, the creating of the documentation in your daily development job. And there are lots of interesting parts. Most of them we already talked about it. And as I promised, there are also slides. There are German version of this talk are already on this page, but I will also put the English version today later. So just to have a look tomorrow at embarc.de/download, and you can just have a look at the slides again. There are some more which I couldn't show. So thanks for your attention, and maybe I heard about it. could be a few questions in the chat, or otherwise, just write me an email, contact me on Twitter, and I will be happy to help you and to discuss your questions or some more things about this cool idea of documentation as code.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because just in case we can't cover all questions, then yes, dear audience, feel free to contact Falk and he will probably answer. But here's the first question for you for now. What if the client requires Word, or even better, requires a certain template to be used?
You know, that's quite easy question. The question was maybe too early, and I showed you later that we can also generate Word documents because of the docbook format. And it's possible to have templates for corporate identity with logos and yeah, maybe footer, header, and copyright information. Yeah, that would be quite easy. So short form, short answer.
Great, quick round. Next question. This is a longer question. You mentioned with documentation in Git, you could export as PDF, for instance, for people that don't generally use Git. Would you suggest still having those documents in a source location where these consumers can find them, and thus you having to keep it up to date, or would it be upon request delivered doc system?
I will try it to find a short answer. I would just keep the sources of my documentation in form of AsciiDoc files and planned UML files in the Git repository. And I will always render the documentation to PDF or Word files or HTML and put it on some SharePoint or file sharing. And I will render it again and again. So if you have this reference to this file sharing, you will always have the same the current version. And you can just, if you send an email, you can just have this link to this reference in this email. You don't have to attach files which get outdated as soon as you have sent the email. So that would be the easiest way. And it's quite easy. I hope it answers your question.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for at least one more question.
Okay, nice.
How to document and communicate? Can you recommend an editor for writing AsciiDoc?
Yeah, there are lots, quite a few editors. Actually, I'm a developer, or I have a developing background, and I already use my IDE. So I'm a Java guy, so I use IntelliJ a lot, and IntelliJ brings this plugin for AsciiDoc, and it's very, very useful. So I would suggest if you also use an IDE, then you don't have to switch between IDE and editor, then just use a plugin for your favorite IDE. And I think there are also lots of editors which have plugins like Sublime or like Visual Studio Code. It's not really an IDE, it's also more an editor. They also have plugins. And I think there are also AsciiDoc editor special ones, but I don't know them at the moment. So I think it's fine to have a plugin for your IDE.
All right, thank you. So thank you for joining us. I think we don't have time for any more questions, but as you said, if anyone has any more questions, I think there were a couple of more questions in the chat, just get in touch, or as I said before, join the discussion rooms at 6:15. Thank you for being here, and also thank you to the audience for your attention. Please don't forget to give us feedback if you like. That really helps everyone. And the last session for today will be Jeff Sussner's keynote, so please don't miss it. And other than that, have a good evening. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you as well. Bye-bye.